Hey everybody, Braden here. Welcome back to another episode of my Road to Chess Mastery. And today we are going to be covering game number 2, round number 5 in my 11th tournament. So just to clarify, I did not play the first 3 rounds. This was a weekly tournament and you can kind of just join whenever and play whatever rounds you want to. But it is a 5-round tournament and again, I just did not play the first 3 rounds. So anyways, I am now playing with the black pieces against Honorad. And let's see how the game continues. We see e4, and I played c5. So even though I said before, a couple of games back, maybe about a tournament back, I ended up quitting c5. This wasn't quite yet. I was transitioning into another opening, but it's something that I just wasn't playing at the time. We see knight to f3, and I played d6. Now we see d4 going for the open Sicilian. And we go into the Najdorf, as this is what I was playing at the time. This was what I was most experienced with against e4. We see bishop c4. So this is a different type of Sicilian now. Normally we see bishop g5, bishop e3. I think these are the most common two that we've seen, even bishop e2. But bishop to c4 is a very good line. It's the Scheveningen, as they say. And the whole point of this is, well, you're trying to attack not only f7, but after e6, the e6 pawn can be weak. There might be some eventual sacrifices that are possible against this pawn. But after bishop b3, I played bishop e7, just getting ready to castle, f4, and queen to c7. Not castling yet. I think this move is very important because they do have the idea of e5, and well, if you can make a move that improves a piece while also preventing their plans, it's exactly what you should be doing. And after castles, they didn't add another attacker by castling. And when they play castles, they're not trying to get e5 in again. But again, this just helps prevent e5, which is very key in this position. Queen to e1. Now they're adding another attacker, preparing the move e5 even further. I played knight to c6, which is an interesting move. The whole point is, well, if you end up taking and playing e5, I'm not actually too concerned. First off, I can take, possibly, but I could also just play knight to d5 immediately, and I'm trying to argue, hey, this isn't actually so bad for me. And I think there's reason to believe that it isn't. But after this, we see knight to f3, also, again, trying to go for e5. And I played b5, preparing bishop e7. I'm just trying to improve my pieces. And we see a3. I think a3 isn't really too necessary, only because b4 isn't really the idea here. The idea is bishop e7. So if they really wanted to try to punish me, maybe e5 would make a little bit more sense here. But also, the problem with e5 is after takes knight to d7, bishop to f4, my pieces do kind of open up quite easily. And sure, they might have some open lines, but maybe my opponent was hesitant to go into this at the time. So anyways, a3 was played, preventing b4, and bishop b7. After bishop to e3, just normal development moves, getting onto this diagonal, which isn't really the worst thing because it can be a bit of a weakness for white. I played knight to a5, and I had 2 ideas behind this move. The first idea is I'm attacking the bishop on b3, but most importantly, what's no longer defended in their position? It's the e4 pawn. When I play knight to c6 and they played bishop e3, it's because that pawn was still defended. However, after knight a5, I'm threatening to win the bishop pair, and this bishop on b3, although it might not look good, it's actually a very important piece. Not just that, we need to also talk about the fact that if I take and they take with the c pawn, that's also another improvement for me, because their pawn structure isn't actually that great here, and these 2 pawns can often become very, very weak in this position. So this would just benefit me greatly if I were able to just take. But instead, my opponent went for more dire straits. They went for the move e5, which is interesting, to say the least. I ended up playing knight to d7. The whole point is, if you end up taking on d6, I want to take back and have pressure against f4. And I still am threatening to take on b3. So let's just say takes and then takes. Well, now I'm threatening f4 and I'm threatening b3. So the pressure is really not going away in this position. But after knight to d7, we see bishop to a2, and well, now I can win the pawn with bishop, or d takes e5, d takes e5, that is. And after queen to g3, e takes f4, bishop takes f4. They get a little bit of compensation in that their bishop and their queen are quite well coordinated. However, it is a pawn, and it is something I'm happy to have. I played queen to c6, and there are some devious ideas with this move. This isn't just to threaten a possible checkmate, but it's also to possibly liquidate. And just this queen to c6, well, there's not really anything to oppose it. And this is, I believe, quite an interesting move here. Anyways, we see the move king to h1, which actually helps our idea of liquidating here. We're after bishop to f6, bishop to h6, and king to h8. There's no reason to keep this bishop on the square. So king h8 pretty much forces this bishop to move and admit that that bishop h6 move just wasn't good. Now we see bishop to g5 and knight to c4. I thought knight to c4 was necessary. There's a few ideas behind it, but the most important one is it blocks out this bishop, and if they take, I can take with the b pawn, and well, this b8 file can be a good way to target their b2 pawn. Bishop takes c4 and b takes c4, so I ended up getting what I wanted. I can play rook b8, maybe a bishop a8, and this pawn could be a potential weakness in the position, especially if you get to an endgame. But anyways, we see the move rook a to e1 now, which doesn't really appear to do too much. I mean, it just improves a piece, so I can't really say anything too bad against it, but it's just looking like it's a pretty good position for me. And again, I'm up a pawn, and it doesn't really feel like there's much compensation anymore. h6, queen to h3, and unfortunately, this move is not quite that good, because now I can trade everything on the board and force a endgame where I'm up another pawn. And how can I do this? Bishop takes g5. We're after knight takes g5, queen takes g2, a nice little sacrifice. The whole point of this move is after queen takes g2, bishop takes g2 with check. So this is why king h1 wasn't so great. King g2 and h takes g5. We now are up 2 pawns, and we might lose the h pawn eventually, but we can try holding on to it the best we can, and we should get a lot of play for it. Now we see rook e4. I played rook a to c8. I can't play rook f to c8, because if we lose f7 in this position, we are probably worse, much worse. So this is not something we'd want to go into. Rook a c8, and then rook to f3. I played knight to f6, and the idea is I possibly want to play a move like g4, where it might not be too easy to actually hold on to or capture the pawn. But they do have a trade. They can try trading the pieces, and then the pawn should be capturable. Rook e5, and I played g4. Rook f4, and rook f to d8. Now, they should probably go for a move like knight to e4 here, where I will end up losing the pawn, but there is a lot of play here where after takes, realistically they should take like this, and then rook to d2. And they're kind of forced to trade, but this trade actually should favor us because of the crazy move c3. And the whole point of this move is now this rook d8 to d2 ideas, where we can win the pawn, or if they just take, then we can take. Their pawn structure is much worse. We're going to be up at least a pawn or 2 pawns here. This has to be much better for black. But okay, my opponent played rook a5, trying to use the principle of 2 weaknesses, go on both sides of the board. I think this makes sense, but rook c6 kind of just covers everything. King to g3, and now rook to d2. Now I'm getting into their position. I'm making things a lot more difficult for them. And rook f2. But in this position, I'm very happy to trade because, well, now I can bring my king into the game, and again, everything is perfectly placed. I'm up 2 pawns. There's not really much I have to do in the sense of trying to create any crazy initiative or anything, because again, we're up 2 pawns. So after king to d4, I played knight to d7. I just thought this was a natural move, possibly preparing the move e5, but also you want to be careful avoiding king to d5. So I wasn't quite prepared for it yet. Now we see knight a2, going for knight b4, and now I have to act fast. And I realized I should be winning in a pretty straightforward manner with the move rook to d6. And I think I was right on this assessment, because after king takes e4, rook d2, we win the h2 pawn, and the g4 pawn is simply too fast. Knight b4 takes, g3, a4, g2, a5, and now e-queen. And this is quite clearly a winning position. Rook to d6, knight e5 check, queen to a1, targeting a5, a6, and now rook to h3. And the whole point of this is we provoke the move c3 and then go back. And now queen to c1. And we're attacking c2 and we're attacking b2. And this is simply over. King b4, we take on b2 first, that's a check. And then take the knight. Queen to b2, take the other pawn. Rook to b2 and queen to c7. And after king to a8, we don't take the rook, we simply checkmate on b8. Now this is a pretty interesting game. It was a lot more complex than the first game in this tournament, and this is actually the end of the tournament, so you will see a rating graph at the end slate of this video. I decided to change it up a little bit, but we did improve our rating by a bit, and that's always nice. But one important thing we should definitely talk about here is making sure that you avoid moves like this where there's a discovery. And whenever you're thinking about discoveries, think, okay, pretend that knight isn't there in the first place and see, okay, is there any preemptive move that I can make to prepare bishop to e3? And that's where your play should arise from, where bishop to e3, as mentioned before, the move knight a5, if the bishop weren't on b3, for example, if the move bishop to a2 was played, then bishop b3 makes more sense, where after knight a5, they can just go bishop f2, and everything is still defended. But unfortunately, my opponent did not think about that, and I definitely got an edge because of it. And that pretty much covers this game. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you in tournament number 12. Thank you for watching, and have a good one.